When I think back to the fall of 2004, the memory still comes to me in fragments, like torn pages scattered across the floor of a dusty library, fragments that don't quite fit together but refuse to fade. It was the year I transferred to Lincoln High School in western Pennsylvania, a town with an old industrial heart, where abandoned steel mills stood like skeletons against the skyline. I was 16, nervous about starting over, and I remember the heavy smell of autumn in the air the first morning I walked into that brick building with its cracked floors and flickering fluorescent lights. It was the kind of school that felt both alive and forgotten, filled with echoes of decades of students before me, their names carved into desks, their graffiti layered on bathroom stalls, their energy lingering in the halls in ways you couldn't explain. The first week was uneventful, mostly introductions, stares from strangers, the awkward process of learning which hallway led where. My locker assignment was in the oldest wing of the school, a place even teachers avoided. That wing hadn't been renovated in decades, and everything about it felt outdated. The rusted lockers that groaned when opened, the chipped paint, the uneven tiles. Students whispered that it used to be the freshman wing, but after several strange accidents years ago, it was mostly abandoned except for a handful of lockers they still assigned to unlucky transfers like me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but soon I realized no one wanted to linger there. My locker was number 117, wedged between two others that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. The metal was dented, scarred, and colder than any of the others, even in warm weather. At first, it was just an inconvenience. I hated how far it was from my classes, but I told myself I'd get used to it. It was only after the second week that I noticed the strangeness. Each morning, when I came in, the locker would be slightly ajar, even though I had locked it the night before. At first, I thought maybe I was careless, rushing too much, but then my books started shifting positions inside. Pens would go missing, notebooks would be open to pages I hadn't touched, and once I found a piece of lined paper, folded neatly in the center of my binder. There was nothing written on it, just a blank sheet, but it felt deliberate, as if someone had placed it there for me to find. I kept telling myself it had to be another student, some prankster who had figured out the combination. But then I started noticing that no one else ever came to that hallway. Not once. Between classes, when the other hallways overflowed with noise and footsteps, this one remained unnaturally quiet. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the silence was unnerving, like stepping into a pocket of air outside time itself. By mid-September, things escalated. One late afternoon, I stayed behind to finish a biology project in the library. When I finally gathered my things and headed toward my locker, the sun was already low, and the hallways had emptied. As I turned into that wing, I felt the temperature drop sharply, like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in faint white wisps, even though it was still warm outside. The silence was suffocating, the kind that presses against your ears until you hear your own blood pumping. When I reached locker 117, it was wide open. Inside, my textbooks were stacked neatly, but on top of them lay something that hadn't been there before, an old Polaroid photograph. The image was faded, the edges curled, but I could make out a group of teenagers standing in the very same hallway, decades earlier. They were all dressed in dated clothes, staring into the camera with uneasy expressions. One of them, a tall boy near the center, stood directly in front of locker 117, his hand resting on it as though claiming it. His face was strangely blurred, as if the film had melted around his features, leaving only a vague outline of a head. My hand shook as I shoved the photo back into the locker and slammed it shut, twisting the combination lock until it clicked. I told myself I was imagining things, that someone had planted the photo to scare me, maybe even a teacher with a cruel sense of humor. But the feeling that settled in my stomach that night was heavier than fear. It was the sinking certainty that I had stepped into something that didn't want to let me go. The days that followed became a blur of unease. I avoided the locker as much as I could, carrying my books with me instead of returning between classes. Still, I couldn't escape it. Each time I passed that hallway, I swore I saw movement in the corner of my vision, a shadow slipping behind the rows of lockers, a faint reflection in the dusty glass of a trophy case. And then came the whispers, faint like the scrape of chalk on an old blackboard, words too soft to understand but close enough that I felt them against my ear. One morning, in late September, I arrived earlier than usual, hoping to grab some notes before class. The building was still dimly lit, the janitor's cart parked near the entrance, the echo of his sweeping faint in the distance. When I turned into the old wing, I froze. My locker was open again, and this time, it wasn't just a photo inside. It was empty, completely empty. My books, binders, even my backpack, everything was gone. I stood there in shock, my mind racing through possibilities. Theft, prank, mistake. But then I noticed the floor beneath the locker. The tiles were wet, darkened as if something had seeped out from inside. I knelt down and touched it, and the moisture was icy, far colder than water. I backed away, heart pounding, and ran to the main office. When I explained that my locker had been emptied, the secretary gave me a blank look, as if she didn't understand. She checked the records, frowned, and finally said something that made my blood run cold. According to their files, locker 117 hadn't been in use for years. In fact, it had been sealed shut after an incident in the late 1980s. She didn't explain further, only said she'd assign me a new locker. I never went back to that hallway again, not willingly. But the story didn't end there. A month later, while flipping through an old yearbook in the library, I stumbled on a class photo from 1987. My stomach dropped when I saw the same group of teenagers from the Polaroid. The same faces, the same uneasy expressions. And there, at the edge of the photo, was the tall boy whose face had been blurred in the Polaroid. Only this time, his features were clear. He looked straight into the camera, eyes dark, expression vacant. His name was listed beneath the photo, and when I looked closer, I saw the note scrawled next to it in pencil. Disappeared. Last seen at locker 117. I closed the yearbook and pushed it away, hands trembling. From that day on, I carried a fear I couldn't explain to anyone. Even now, years later, the memory clings to me like a cold shadow. Sometimes, when I'm alone in quiet hallways, I swear I still hear that faint scraping sound, that whisper that isn't quite words, and I can never shake the feeling that I didn't escape that locker completely, that some part of me was left behind in its frozen silence, waiting to be taken when the time is right. The first day of junior year has a weight to it that I'll never forget, not because of the usual nerves or the heavy pile of textbooks, but because of something that happened to me that year in a small town high school in northern Ohio. It was late August of 2010, the mornings already cooler than summer, but not yet sharp with the bite of fall. I remember the dew on the football field as I walked past it that first morning, and the way the rising sun cast long shadows across the old brick building. The place looked welcoming enough on the outside, but the truth was, I had always felt uneasy about returning to school after summer break, as though the walls themselves remembered too much, and carried a history that the rest of us just pretended not to notice. My school wasn't large, just a few hundred students scattered across 3 floors of hallways that always smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals mixed with the sour scent of old gym mats. The classrooms had their quirks: peeling paint, cracked windows, outdated chalkboards that screeched when the teacher wrote on them. But it was the east wing on the second floor that had the worst reputation. Even before I started junior year, I had heard whispers about it. Students said it was cursed, though no one ever explained clearly what they meant. A few said the hallway was colder than the others. Some claimed lights flickered there for no reason, and others swore that the locked classroom at the very end, room 209, was never to be entered. I didn't believe in ghost stories back then, not really. I thought they were distractions, exaggerated by bored kids who needed drama in their small-town lives. But then I got my new class schedule, and my heart dropped when I saw it. First period history, room 209. The first morning I walked down that east hallway, the difference was immediate. The main hallway had been buzzing with noise, chatter, and slamming lockers. But as soon as I turned into the east wing, the air grew still, heavy, almost suffocating. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, and though it was still summer weather outside, I felt a chill along my arms, as though I had stepped into a different season. My footsteps echoed more loudly here, bouncing back unnaturally off the faded walls. Room 209 was at the very end, the door painted a dull green, its number plaque slightly tilted. When I stepped inside, I expected the usual chaos of a first-day class, but what struck me immediately was how empty it felt. The desks were arranged neatly, the blackboard was spotless, but there was a silence in that room unlike any I had ever experienced in a classroom before. Even when the other students came in and took their seats, the usual buzz of conversation felt hushed, dampened, as if the walls swallowed every sound. The teacher walked in then, and at first, nothing seemed unusual. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with a stern face framed by silver hair tied back tightly. Her clothes were simple but dated, almost like something out of a decade before. She didn't introduce herself, didn't smile, didn't ask us about our summers like every other teacher had. Instead, she opened a thick, leather-bound book, the kind you didn't see much anymore, and began reading dates and events in a flat monotone, her voice steady, unwavering, and strangely detached. There was no warmth, no pauses, no eye contact, just a steady drone of history lessons, as though she had delivered the same words for years without change. The strangeness of it sank in slowly over the days that followed. She never once called any of us by name. She never wrote on the board. She never gave handouts. Every morning, she arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, opened that same book, and read until the bell rang. And every morning, the air in that classroom grew colder, to the point where students began bringing jackets despite the lingering summer outside. Some joked about it, but others stopped showing up, claiming their schedules had been changed. By the second week, there were only 8 of us left in the room, though I could have sworn more names had been listed originally. One morning, curiosity got the better of me. I arrived early and sat in the front row, determined to get a better look at the book she always read from. When she entered, the room seemed to darken slightly, though no lights had changed. She set the book on the desk, and as she opened it, I craned my neck just enough to glimpse the pages. My blood ran cold when I realized they were completely blank. No words, no dates, no ink, just empty, yellowed pages. I sat frozen, heart pounding, while she began to read from the blank paper in that same monotone voice. The words were precise, factual, but her eyes never blinked, her face never moved, and her voice never shifted in tone. It was like she wasn't teaching us at all, but reciting something burned into her being. I tried to convince myself it was some strange teaching method, but doubt gnawed at me. And then came the morning that changed everything. It was mid-September, the sky still dark when I entered the school. I walked toward the east wing and noticed something strange. The lights were already on, though the halls were otherwise empty. I could hear faint footsteps ahead of me, measured and steady. When I reached the doorway to room 209, I froze. The teacher was standing at the front of the classroom, but the room was empty of desks. The chairs were gone, the tables vanished. It was just her, standing before rows of invisible students, speaking to the empty air in that same flat voice. The chill in the room was unbearable, like standing outside in January without a coat. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as she turned slowly toward the doorway, her eyes fixed on me, sharp and cold, and for the first time, her lips curved into something resembling a smile. But it wasn't warm. It was hollow knowing. I stumbled back into the hallway and ran, not stopping until I reached the crowded main hall, my chest heaving with panic. For the rest of that week, I avoided the East Wing, made excuses, begged the office to move my schedule, but every time I asked, the secretary would frown and say no such class existed. There was no history class in room 209. In fact, she told me, room 209 had been locked for years after a teacher passed away during class in the late 1980s. She had collapsed suddenly at her desk mid-lecture, in front of a room full of horrified students. When I insisted I'd been attending class there every morning, she shook her head and pulled out my schedule. According to her records, I was assigned to history in room 112, with a teacher whose name I didn't recognize. I left the office in a daze, clutching the paper, but when I returned to the east hallway, room 209 was sealed shut with the heavy padlock across the door. I stared at it for a long time, trying to process how I had spent weeks inside a classroom that wasn't supposed to exist, with a teacher who hadn't been alive in decades. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that room. All I know is that sometimes, when I sit in silence long enough, I still hear her voice in my head, flat, steady, reciting dates that blur into nothingness. And every fall, as the school year begins again, I dream of that classroom. In the dream, the desks are always filled, the air is always freezing, and I'm back in that front row, staring at a book of blank pages while a teacher who never left continues her endless lesson. My name is Daniel, and when I think about my high school years in upstate New York, I remember two things most clearly: the way the winters could swallow everything in white silence, and the memory of a girl who shouldn't have been in my classroom, but somehow was. In the fall of 2007, I was starting my sophomore year at Brookfield High. I wasn't the most social kid. You could usually find me sketching in the back of my notebooks or listening to music through one earbud tucked under my hoodie. I had a couple of close friends, but I wasn't popular, and I didn't want to be. My parents had divorced the summer before, and school felt like the one steady thing in my life, even though I dreaded the social pressure of returning after break. Brookfield High wasn't big, maybe 500 students total, but the building had history. Parts of it dated back to the 1930s, and the architecture showed it. Arched windows that rattled in storms, stairwells that creaked, and long, narrow hallways that seemed too dark even on bright afternoons. The older students whispered about the forgotten floor, a set of unused classrooms that had been locked for years after a fire in the 1970s. I never thought much about it. Stories like that floated around every school. That September, I was placed in Mrs. Walker's English class, third period. She was a thin, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, known for her strict grading, but also for pushing students to write more than they thought they could. Her classroom was on the second floor, a narrow room with rows of desks facing a chalkboard that always smelled faintly of old erasers. I sat near the middle because it was safer than the front, but less invisible than the back. It was in that room that I first noticed her. She sat in the last row, third seat from the left, close to the windows. At first glance, she didn't stand out, just another student quietly keeping to herself. She had long dark hair, pale skin, in clothes that looked slightly outdated, like she'd walked out of a yearbook photo from the early 1990s. She never raised her hand, never spoke, never made eye contact with anyone. But I noticed her because I noticed quiet people. And there was something about the way she sat, rigid, unmoving, her gaze always fixed either on the chalkboard or out the window, that made her presence feel heavier than anyone else's in the room. Weeks went by, and I realized something odd. Mrs. Walker never once called on her, never acknowledged her. In fact, it was as if the teacher didn't even see her. The roll was taken every morning, but her name was never spoken. I tried to listen for it, but no one seemed to react as if a seat was occupied there at all. I remember one afternoon in late September, when the air had started to cool and the leaves outside burned orange against the sky. We were doing peer review essays, passing papers between desks, scribbling notes in the margins. I turned to hand mine back, and for the first time, I looked directly into her face. Her eyes were the first thing I noticed, gray, distant, unblinking. She stared at me as if she had been waiting for me to look, and the air in my chest froze. Her expression didn't change, not even a twitch of recognition. She just kept staring until I broke away, my pulse racing. When I glanced back again, she had shifted her gaze out the window, as though the moment hadn't happened at all. The strange thing was, when I asked my friend Mark later if he'd ever noticed a girl in the back row, he frowned and shook his head. He thought I was making it up. I laughed it off, pretended it was a joke, but a knot formed in my stomach that wouldn't go away. By early October, the unease had deepened. I would catch her reflection in the window glass, even when she wasn't seated there. Once, during a quiet test, I felt a sharp chill behind me, and when I turned, her chair was empty, though I swore she had been there moments earlier. Another time, I dropped my pen, bent to pick it up, and when I looked under the desks, I saw her feet, not moving, not shifting, just planted firmly on the floor, though her chair had appeared empty. One Friday, the tension came to a breaking point. Mrs. Walker had left us with a silent reading assignment, the kind where the room is filled with the sound of pages turning. My eyes kept drifting back, and once again, she was staring at me. Not at the board, not out the window, directly at me. Her lips were moving, though no sound came out. My heart slammed in my chest. I forced myself to look away, but the sensation of being watched pressed down on me like a weight. When the bell finally rang, I gathered my things quickly and hurried out. But as I stepped into the hallway, I realized I had forgotten my notebook. Reluctantly, I turned back. The room was already emptying, students spilling into the corridor, voices echoing. When I stepped inside, the classroom was nearly deserted, but not entirely. She was still there, seated at her desk in the back row, staring straight ahead as though frozen in place. The room was unnervingly quiet. I snatched my notebook and turned to leave, but curiosity gnawed at me. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud as I made my way down the aisle toward the back row. Her eyes followed me, unblinking, and I swear the closer I got, the colder the air became. When I reached her desk, I froze. Her hands were folded neatly on top, but they weren't like any hands I'd seen before. They were gray, almost translucent, the veins beneath her skin dark like rivers. Her nails were jagged, cracked. She sat completely still, expressionless, and when I finally found the courage to look her in the eyes again, I realized they weren't gray at all. They were colorless, like cloudy glass, and deep inside them was a hollow emptiness that made my stomach twist. I stumbled back, knocking into the desk behind me, and when I blinked, she was gone. The desk was empty. I ran out of the classroom, gasping for breath, but the image of her eyes burned into my mind. For the rest of the semester, I avoided looking back at that row, but even when I didn't, I could feel her there. It wasn't until December that I learned the truth. While digging through old yearbooks for a history project, I found a photo of the sophomore English class from 1993. My heart stopped when I saw her sitting in the back row, third seat from the left, hair long and dark, the same pale face, the same distant expression. Her name was printed beneath the photo, but it was followed by a date of death. She had died that winter in a car accident on her way home from school. I stared at that yearbook page until my vision blurred. The realization hit me with a force I can't describe. She hadn't been a classmate. She had been a memory of someone who never left that room, repeating the motions of a life cut short. Even now, years later, when I pass a classroom and see a girl sitting silently in the back row, I hesitate to look too closely, because I know that sometimes the people who occupy those seats aren't really there, and if you make the mistake of meeting their gaze, you'll carry their emptiness with you forever. My name is Sarah, and when I think back to my high school years in Indiana, there's one memory that has never faded, even though more than 15 years have passed. It isn't the memory of prom, or of graduation, or even of the friends I had then. It's the memory of a door in the basement locker room, a door that led somewhere it shouldn't have, and of the girl who never came back after opening it. It was the fall of 2008, the start of junior year, and like every other teenager, I was trying to find that fragile balance between keeping up with classes, hanging out with friends, and not letting the pressure of everything collapse on top of me. The first weeks of school were always strange. Warm mornings that still felt like summer, followed by cool nights that hinted at the season ahead. The building itself carried that mix too. The classrooms hot and stuffy, the hallways cold with drafts that slipped through cracks in the old walls. Our high school was big for our town, a sprawling brick building with 3 floors above ground and a basement level that most students tried to avoid. The basement was where the old gym locker rooms were, along with a few storage areas that were mostly kept locked. The air down there was always damp, heavy with the smell of chlorine from the pool that hadn't been used in over a decade. It felt forgotten, a place students only went when they had to. That September, I had gym class last period of the day, which meant I often had to go down into that basement to change. I hated it. The flickering fluorescent lights, the sound of pipes groaning overhead, the way your footsteps echoed too loudly against the tiled walls. There were dozens of lockers down there, most rusted, many stuck shut, but a few still in use for our class. The room always felt colder than the rest of the school, and no one ever lingered longer than necessary. It was in that locker room that I first noticed the door. It wasn't like the others. Most of the doors down there were heavy steel or painted gray. This one was different. Narrow, wooden, painted a dull brown, with a handle that looked older than the rest of the building. It sat in the far corner, half hidden behind a row of unused lockers. There was no sign on it, no label, and I had never seen anyone use it. But sometimes, when I was changing after class, I swore I heard faint sounds from the other side. Soft footsteps, a shuffle like fabric against the floor. Even once what I could have sworn was the sound of someone breathing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The basement already played tricks on you. The acoustics carried noises strangely, and water dripping through pipes could sound like almost anything. But then other students began mentioning it too. A girl named Amanda said she'd heard humming from behind the door one afternoon, a low, tuneless sound that stopped the moment she froze to listen. Another student joked that it was where the janitors kept their ghosts. Then came the night of the homecoming game. Our football team wasn't good, but the whole town came out anyway, filling the bleachers under the cold October sky. After the game, students hung around, laughing, talking, making plans. I remember Amanda telling me she was running back into the building to grab her backpack from her gym locker because she'd forgotten it earlier in the day. I offered to go with her, but she waved me off, saying it would only take a minute. That was the last time anyone saw her. At first, no one panicked. Students lost track of each other all the time after games, drifting between groups or leaving with friends. But when Amanda didn't answer her phone that night, her parents grew worried. By the next morning, when she still hadn't come home, the school was buzzing with fear. Teachers tried to keep order, but whispers spread faster than facts. Some said she'd run away. Others said she'd been picked up by someone outside the school. But I knew where she had gone last. She had gone into that basement locker room. The police searched the school thoroughly. They questioned students, reviewed security cameras. The cameras showed Amanda walking into the school alone after the game. They never showed her coming out. When investigators finally went into the basement, I remember standing at the edge of the caution tape, heart pounding. I could see them moving through the locker room, opening doors, shining flashlights. They stopped at that wooden door in the corner. One of them rattled the handle, frowned, then called another officer over. I watched as they forced it open with a crowbar. The door swung inward, revealing only darkness. They went in with flashlights, their beams cutting across dust and broken tiles. A few minutes later, they came back out, shaking their heads. According to the report, the room behind the door was just an old storage space. Empty. Nothing unusual. No sign of Amanda. But I had seen the look on one officer's face as he stepped out of that room. He had gone pale, his jaw tight, and when he caught me staring at him, he looked away quickly, as though he didn't want me to read what he'd seen. Amanda was never found. Her disappearance haunted the town for years. For a while, posters with her photo were taped to every window, every streetlight. Students cried in hallways. Teachers tried to comfort us, but time kept moving forward. By the end of the school year, her absence had become another scar we carried silently. I graduated, left town, tried to build a life away from those halls, but the memory followed me. Years later, while visiting my parents, I found myself driving past the high school. It had been partially renovated, the entrance modernized, but the building's bones were still the same. Curiosity, or maybe guilt, drew me inside. The halls smelled just as they had, a mix of dust and disinfectant. I wandered down to the basement, my heart pounding with each step. The locker room had been stripped bare, most of the lockers removed, the paint fresh. But when I looked to the far corner, I froze. The wooden door was still there. Same dull brown, same old handle. I walked toward it slowly, every sound amplified in the silence. My hand trembled as I reached out and touched the handle. It was ice cold, colder than anything else in that basement. For a moment, I thought about opening it, about seeing for myself what lay beyond. But then, faintly, I heard it. Breathing. Slow, steady, unmistakable. On the other side of that door. I turned and fled, my footsteps echoing behind me as though something followed. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the open sky. To this day, I don't know what was behind that door, or what happened to Amanda after she walked through it. All I know is that sometimes, in the quiet of night, when the world is still, I think I hear that same slow breathing, and I know that door is still there, waiting, in the basement of Brookfield High. The first weeks of September always brought the same weight into the air, that strange heaviness when the long, empty silence of summer was broken by the sudden rush of hundreds of footsteps, locker doors slamming, and voices echoing down the tiled corridors. The building had been empty for months, and when it filled again, it seemed almost reluctant to accept it, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of holding secrets and were unhappy to be disturbed again. There was one hallway, tucked near the second-floor stairwell, That always felt different, even with students filling the building. The noise seemed to fade when you walked down that stretch, the laughter and chatter of classmates dying away, until all you could hear was the echo of your own shoes against the floor. The air felt colder there, the fluorescent lights dimmer, like the ceiling bulbs were straining to hold onto their glow. I never thought much of it, until I noticed the locker. It looked ordinary from far away, just one door among hundreds, but the closer you got, the more it stood out. The paint was chipped and dull, the number plate so scratched that it was nearly unreadable. Unlike the other lockers, no decorations clung to its surface, no mirror or magnets or brightly colored stickers. It was empty of life, and yet it drew my eyes every time I walked past, like some unspoken signal urged me to look. No one ever lingered near it. Students shifted away naturally, like they were unconsciously avoiding the space. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, until one day I placed my hand on the handle. The metal was ice cold, far colder than it should have been under the humming lights, and for a moment I swore I felt a faint vibration, as though something behind the door was pressing outward, alive and waiting. I yanked my hand back immediately, pulse racing, and walked away without daring to glance behind me. Weeks passed, but I couldn't shake the locker from my thoughts. It became a silent presence, a shadow in my day. Sometimes, walking past, I thought I heard the faintest sound coming from within, like a page being turned or a fingernail tapping slowly against metal. Once, in the dim light after school, I thought I saw movement through the narrow slit along the doorframe, the kind of shifting shadow that shouldn't exist in an empty space. Rumors floated around, vague and broken, spoken only in half-whispers. Some said years ago a student had gone missing during the school day and was never seen again, last spotted near that very hallway. Others said the locker had been sealed off because of a maintenance issue no one wanted to talk about. The teachers avoided questions about it entirely. The janitors, though, told the truth without words, the way their eyes flickered away whenever they pushed their mop buckets past it, the way they muttered to themselves if the hallway was too quiet. One evening, I stayed behind to finish an assignment in the library. By the time I left, the building was nearly empty. The silence of the deserted halls pressed against me as I made my way toward the stairs. When I reached that familiar stretch of hallway, I froze. The locker door, usually sealed tight, seemed slightly ajar. Not open, not enough to see inside, but not closed either. Just the faintest crack, wide enough for the coldest air I had ever felt to seep out into the corridor. My legs carried me forward despite the fear tightening my chest. The closer I got, the heavier the atmosphere grew, as though the air itself resisted my presence. I bent down, staring into the narrow gap. My reflection warped against the metal, but behind it, in the darkness of the locker, something shifted. Not a trick of light, something real, something moving. The noise that followed was faint but undeniable, a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging down the inside of the door. I stumbled back, so fast my bag slipped from my shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed through the emptiness. My eyes stayed locked on the metal door, terrified it would swing wide open, but it didn't. It remained there, slightly cracked, vibrating faintly as the sound of scratching pressed harder, faster, until it stopped all at once. The next day, the locker looked normal again, sealed tight. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual. When I asked around, students brushed me off, insisting that locker had always been jammed and was never assigned. But I couldn't unhear the sound. I couldn't forget the chill. Weeks passed, and my obsession grew. I wrote down the times I heard noises, the days the door looked slightly shifted, the mornings when the air near it was cold enough for my breath to fog. I knew something was there, something waiting. My fear grew alongside my curiosity, two things twisting together until I could barely separate them. Then one morning, I walked into school and found it gone. The locker wasn't there anymore. In its place was a smooth panel of freshly painted wall, as though the metal had never existed. Students hurried past without noticing a thing, as if their memories had been erased. No one remembered it. No one cared. But I remembered. And even now, long after I've left that building behind, I sometimes wake in the night to that same sound, the faint, steady scratching, coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. I had always believed that college would feel like a new beginning, a chance to leave behind the quiet routines of high school and finally step into a wider, freer world. Moving into the dorms was supposed to be part of that excitement, the first taste of independence, living among other students, creating new friendships in a building that seemed alive with voices, footsteps, and late-night laughter. But as I settled in that fall semester, I realized the building itself held something else, something no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone seemed to sense once the lights dimmed and the hallways grew silent. Our dormitory was old, a brick structure that had stood for decades, with narrow corridors and wooden doors that creaked loudly whenever they opened. The paint was chipped, and the floorboards always seemed to groan beneath our weight. Still, it had a charm about it in the daylight, with sunlight spilling through tall windows and music drifting faintly from open rooms. At night, however, the atmosphere changed completely. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, the laughter died away, and the silence seemed to press against the walls, thick and suffocating. There was one room on the third floor that everyone avoided, room 309. It looked identical to the others, but no one lived there. The door was always locked, and though the housing office claimed it was simply out of use, rumors spread quickly. Some said a student had taken their life inside years before. Others whispered about a fire, about screams in the night, about a roommate who vanished without explanation. Whatever the truth was, 309 stood empty, a hollow space in an otherwise crowded hall. I didn't think much of it at first, but the longer I lived there, the more I noticed. At night, when I walked past to reach my own room, I felt the air shift, growing colder around that one door. Sometimes I thought I heard movement inside, faint shuffling, the scrape of a chair, or something heavier dragging across the floor. A few times, I caught the glimmer of light from the crack beneath the door, even though the room was supposed to be locked and abandoned. One evening, returning from a late study session, I found myself alone in the hallway. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, too loud in the silence. As I neared 309, I stopped. The door was slightly open, just enough to reveal the edge of darkness inside. My throat tightened. I knew it should have been locked. It was always locked. I stood frozen, staring at the gap, and then I heard it. The sound of breathing, slow, ragged, coming from the other side of the door. I forced myself to move, hurrying past without looking again, locking myself in my own room and trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the fear stayed with me. That night, I dreamed of standing in the hallway again, the door wide open, the darkness inside swallowing everything around it. When I woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and for a moment I swore I could still hear breathing in the room with me. The following week, things grew worse. My roommate left for the weekend, and I was alone in the dorm. That Saturday night, I woke to a sound knocking. 3 slow knocks, coming from somewhere close. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening. The hallway was silent, but then the knocks came again, this time louder. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against it. The sound was coming from 309. I wanted to run, to leave the building entirely, but something compelled me closer. I stepped into the hallway, trembling. The carpet cold beneath my bare feet. The door to 309 was shut again, but the knocking continued, steady, deliberate. My hand shook as I reached out and touched the knob. To my shock, it turned easily. The door creaked open, and I peered inside. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the hallway behind me. It was empty, no furniture, no bed, just bare walls and a floor covered in dust. But in the far corner, I saw movement. A shape crouched low, too dark to fully see, its outline shifting unnaturally. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't crouching at all. It was standing, slowly, impossibly tall, its head almost grazing the ceiling. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my chest heaving. The knocking stopped instantly. The hallway was silent again. I locked myself in my room and didn't leave until morning. The next day, I tried to explain what I had seen, but my friends laughed it off, insisting it was stress, lack of sleep, or my imagination playing tricks. Still, when I asked around, others admitted to hearing things too. Strange noises at night, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, shadows moving under the crack of the door when they passed by. No one wanted to be the one to say it out loud, but we all knew something was wrong with that room. By the end of the semester, the door to 309 had been sealed shut with heavy bolts, a fresh coat of paint covering the number. The housing office refused to answer questions, but the whispers never stopped. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of that door creaking open, of the darkness waiting inside, and of the impossibly tall figure that still seems to be standing there, waiting for me to return. My name isn't important, but for context, I was in my junior year of high school when this happened, living in a quiet suburban town where the biggest drama usually came from football games or who was dating who. I wasn't the type of student people noticed. I wasn't the top of the class, but I worked hard enough. I wasn't athletic, but I kept to myself and blended in easily. If anything defined me, it was that I preferred the quiet corners of the library over the crowded cafeteria, and I often stayed late to finish assignments, because home wasn't always the best place to concentrate. That habit is what drew me into the school one evening in late October, long after the final bell had rung and most of the building was empty. The air outside was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces, but inside the school, everything felt stale, still, and slightly damp, as if the walls had been sweating in the day's last bit of heat. The lights buzzed overhead in their usual tired way, and the hollow echo of my shoes against the tile seemed much louder than it should have been. The librarian had left early that day, so I decided to work in the study hall room near the back of the building. It wasn't a place students usually went unless they had detention or needed quiet, so it was empty when I entered. Rows of desks stretched under the dim light, and the windows overlooked the football field, now covered in shadows as the sun sank behind the bleachers. I sat near the middle, dropped my books on the desk, and tried to focus. At first, everything was fine. The silence was thick but manageable, broken only by the scratch of my pencil and the occasional creak of the building settling. But as the minutes dragged into an hour, I became aware of something strange. The atmosphere seemed heavier, almost like the air was pressing against me. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired. But then I realized the fluorescent lights above me had dimmed slightly. They still glowed, but softer, weaker, like a dying candle. I glanced toward the clock on the wall. The hand showed just after 6, but the second hand wasn't moving. I tapped my pencil nervously, staring, and after a long pause it jumped forward with a loud click, then froze again. My throat tightened, a slow unease building inside me. That was when I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They didn't sound like a teacher or a student. They sounded too uneven, too dragged out, as though the weight behind them was unnatural. I froze in my seat, holding my breath. The steps grew closer, echoing against the lockers. The knob of the study hall door rattled once, twice, then went still. My heart hammered, so hard I could hear it in my ears. The door didn't open, but the footsteps didn't retreat either. Instead, there was a pause, followed by the faint sound of breathing. Not normal breathing. It was shallow, raspy, as if whoever or whatever was outside the door hadn't breathed fresh air in years. I wanted to run, but something in me wouldn't allow it. My legs felt rooted to the ground, heavy as stone. The breathing continued, filling the silence, until finally it faded away, replaced again by the slow scrape of footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited a full 5 minutes before daring to move. Gathering my things, I shoved them into my bag and headed for the door. But when I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Every locker door was open, not just a few here and there, every single one. Rows upon rows of gaping metal mouths stretched down the hall on both sides, their interiors dark and hollow. The sight sent a wave of nausea through me. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. I told myself it was impossible, that someone must have pulled a prank. But the silence was too complete, too consuming. There was no laughter, no whispers, no movement except my own. I turned back toward the study hall, only to find the door had disappeared. Where it had been, there was now just smooth, unbroken wall, painted the same dull color as the rest of the hallway. Panic surged through me as I spun around, searching for an exit. But the school had shifted somehow. The familiar hallways stretched longer than they should have, twisting at impossible angles. Staircases that I knew should have led up to the science wing, instead curling downward into darkness. My steps echoed unnaturally, bouncing back in ways that didn't match my movements. The lockers seemed to close in around me, their doors creaking slowly, one after another, until only a narrow path remained. Somewhere in the darkness, I heard that same raspy breathing again, closer this time, as if the sound was crawling through the air vents, following me. I don't know how long I wandered. Time didn't work properly there. The clocks were all frozen, their hands shaking in place, but never moving forward. The windows showed nothing but blackness. No matter how close I pressed my face to the glass, the deeper I went, the more the building groaned, like it was alive, shifting its bones around me. Eventually, I found myself standing before the gym doors. They were the only set of doors still shut. I pushed them open and stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. Rot, thick and suffocating, like meat left out too long in the sun. The bleachers were pulled out, and on them sat row after row of students, all dressed in old uniforms and clothes from different decades. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, unmoving. Some still clutched books, other sports gear, but all were perfectly still, as if they had been waiting there for years. At first, I thought they were mannequins, but then slowly, heads began to turn toward me in unison. Dozens of lifeless eyes locked on mine, and the raspy breathing I had heard before filled the room, multiplied 100 times over. I staggered back, stumbling into the hallway again, running blindly as the sound followed, growing louder with every turn I took. My bag slipped from my shoulder, books scattering across the tile, but I didn't dare stop. The school twisted and shifted, hallways closing behind me, doors melting into walls, until finally, by some impossible stroke of luck, I burst through an exit door and into the cold night air. When I turned back, the school looked normal. Windows lit, doors solid, nothing out of place. Students walked past laughing, heading to their cars as if the building had never changed at all. But my watch told me hours had passed, though I had gone inside at dusk. My parents said I was gone the entire night, I never returned after dark again. And sometimes, when I drive past the school at night, I see faces in the windows, pale, unmoving, watching.